Hi everybody, I'm Holly and today I'll be discussing how mining increases predation risk for a behaviourally unique endangered reptile. So firstly, the maintenance and return of fauna is critical on mining tenements and sites of mine site restoration so that we don't just have areas of vegetation but healthy functioning ecosystems. And one way that land managers often help to protect species, particularly threatened species, is through translocating organisms away from an immediate threat. For example, if there's clearing due to ore extraction. However, in a review that was published at the end of last year as a part of my PhD research, it was found that actually less than a quarter of all mitigation translocations around the world actually result in self-sustaining populations, and there's a much greater need to understand the actual complex biological requirements of those organisms before you move them to give them the greatest chance of success for long-term establishment. And so my PhD research is looking at understanding the biological complex requirements of a case study species, the western spiny-tailed skink, or Agurnia stokesii bardia. So they grow up to almost 20 centimetres in snout vent length. And if I can use the laser, you can see they're quite distinct. They've got spiny scales, but particularly spiny scales along their tail. And they're also quite unique for a reptile species because they live together in colonies, in family groups, and they live within a single log complex throughout the year permanently. The skinks are endemic to the Midwest of Western Australia, and you can see the bubble here. And I selected them as a case study species for my research for a number of different reasons. The first being they're endangered, so any translocations will be high risk. They live within high risk areas, so they are on mining tenements where translocations will occur in the future. And there's been no recorded successful translocations so far, which means there does need to be a strategy put in place to maximise success for translocations in the future. And this involves understanding the requirements such as diet, habitat and predation management. And for the rest of this talk, I'll just focus on understanding what predators they have and how to manage them. So within the Midwest of Western Australia, the skinks live in open semi-arid eucalypt woodland, and you can see in the images it's quite open and there's a patchy distribution of vegetation resources, and to reflect this we suspected there would also be an uneven distribution of predators across the landscape. On the left here I have an example of a fallen log that's become a log complex. And we predicted, because log piles are known to be good habitat for a number of invertebrate and small vertebrate species, that these activity centres of log piles could potentially draw in predators and congregate predators. And in particular, we thought that for my project, log piles containing the spiny-tailed skink might in particular draw in predators. This is because the colonies are permanent within the log pile throughout the year, representing a consistent, predictable source of prey for predators, but they also create latrines just outside of the log and continually add to the latrine pile. So this could be potentially a constant olfactory cue that could lure the predators in. Now, this is my field study site. I work on a stretch that's about 50 kilometres in length on a mining tenement within the Midwest. And on the image over here is a big salt lake, and then there's the open eucalypt woodland is in different patches throughout here, and then over here is the active mining area with the X representing a landfill site. And within my research area, I was interested in understanding for predator abundance, was it greatest around these log piles like I suspected? And then again, particularly around the log piles containing skinks. And thirdly, I was also interested in that area near where the landfill site was there also a greater number of predators? Potentially the landfill acting as an anthropogenic food source, which could make predators more abundant in that area. And for predator hunting behaviour, again, I was interested were predators most often actively hunting around log pile sites and then log pile sites containing skinks. And the first step to understanding this was I completed plasticine model experiments. So this meant I created replica models of the skinks out of plasticine and put these at sites with log piles. There's an example on the screen, and then sites without log piles. And because the plasticine is quite soft, it maintains any bite, peck or scratch marks by predators. I can use these to ID what's actually tried to attack them. Here is an example of a corvid, which has found one of my models in the field. And it might be tricky to see, but you can see it's taken all the limbs off and has one in its mouth. And here are some examples of some minor attacks I got on my plasticine models. So we have some notches on the head, on the tail, and on the limbs here. And this is in stark contrast to these very lethal attacks I found on models. So this is an example of a corvid attack, and they seemed, they'd take the head off, the tail off, the limbs off, and then they gouge out the middle. So I'd count that as definitely a lethal attack. And in conjunction with this, I also conducted predatory bird surveys. So bird species that would be able to feed on vertebrates that are the approximate size of the skink. So they were suspected predators. And I conducted these surveys at sites, log piles with skinks, log piles without skinks, and then sites without log piles to see if the abundance changed at these different sites. And I also completed these surveys across different seasons. And thirdly, I also put 30 camera traps out across that stretch on the mining tenement. And again, sites without log piles, sites with log piles, and then sites with log piles containing skinks, to see if not only the number of predators I saw on camera images changed, but also if I could identify any predator behaviour changes. And these cameras were out in the field for about 3 years. Here are some examples of some predators that I caught on camera. So we have a feral cat here on the left, and it's a bit trickier to see because it looks like a stick, but we have a Varanus tristis, so you can see its head and its body goes up into its distinct curly tail. And here, unfortunately, I have an example of a feral cat in the corner that has caught a spiny-tailed skink. So this is not one of my models, this is an actual skink. And so it shows that not only can they catch juvenile skinks as we thought they could, but they're actually quite capable of catching and feeding on adult western spiny-tailed skinks. Okay, now I'll go through the results of the different experiments and how they all fit together. So for predator abundance, going by the predatory bird surveys I undertook, we found that the number of predatory birds was much greater at log piles that contain the skinks compared to both log piles that didn't have any skinks and open space. At all of these sites, we also found that corvids were the most abundant predatory species, and this was particularly the case at inhabited log piles, again, containing the skinks. And the cameras showed no difference in predator abundance, only behaviour, and I'll go into this soon. For distance to landfill, it was found that the number of predatory birds did increase with proximity to the landfill site. However, the number of attacks on plasticine models did not vary according to distance towards the landfill site, and all predators that were found to attack the models were found to actually just be corvids. And with predator behaviour, so on all my camera trap images, I looked for potential predators that were mammals, birds, and reptiles, and then recorded their observation, movement, or action responses as they moved across the frame. So this was basically were they stalking or sniffing. Here's an example of a cat that's sniffing at the log pile. So this was considered an active hunting behaviour. And then I compared these behaviours across, again, sites with logs containing skinks, just logs, and sites without logs. And what I found was that in general, predators hunted most often at logs combined compared to just open space. Cats were found to hunt most often at log piles containing the skinks compared to just open space. And there were more corvids hunting at inhabited log piles compared to both uninhabited logs and open sites. So overall, this tells us that yes, predators did appear to target log piles like I expected. And some of these predators, particularly the corvids, appeared to target log piles containing the skinks in particular. And we also found that predatory birds did increase in abundance towards the landfill sites near the landfill area. And so this tells us, in regards to management of the western spiny-tailed skink, the two predators of most interest are probably the feral cat and corvids. So corvids are known to travel tens of kilometres in search or to access anthropogenic food sources, such as a landfill site. And this does appear to be what we saw at this site with the greater abundance around the landfill. And even though they are a native predator within the system, they can thrive in human modified landscapes, and access to this artificial food source can increase and augment population size, which can then suppress prey species. And the feral cat we know is introduced to the system. They're quite capable of living in human modified landscapes. They live across 99% of Australia. And on our footage, we caught that they not only attack juvenile skinks, but are quite capable of attacking adult western spiny-tailed skinks as well. And in regards to translocation management, both of these predators are neophilic, and that means that they're attracted to novel objects and sites. So at a translocation site, which might be modified, for example, the log complex could be modified to benefit the translocated skink individuals. This change in the landscape could attract curious predators, and this means that there should be a strategic management plan in place. For example, soft release fencing, which could benefit the skinks, as reptiles quite often move large distances after translocation. So this can get them used to the release site, and it can prevent predators such as cats coming in. And for corvids, it likely means that control of access to anthropogenic sources of food, such as landfill, is quite important. But understanding predation is just one part of the translocation, and the next step for my project is understanding what makes an optimal log pile. So I've already undertaken ground-based LiDAR scanning of log complexes all throughout the mining tenement. And through scanning all around the log pile, this allows me to create a 3D point cloud model on the computer, which I can then analyze to see if there are certain traits, such as number of branches, size of hollows, which the skinks continually select. And this can help me either design or select a translocation site for the future. And here is an example of one of my scans. So it's a little blurry on the PowerPoint, but you can see in the center, we have the log structure, but the 3D scan allows us to understand more information, such as canopy cover, surrounding mid-story and ground cover. And then I can isolate that further and look at number of branches, size of hollows, length of the log system. And then I can quantify if there are any traits that continually be selected for. And again, this can help select translocation sites. So overall, there are specific biotic and behavioural requirements of an organism, which really should be considered when designing and undertaking translocation in order to maximise the likelihood that those organisms will establish long-term. And this helps minimise conservation effort, as well as conservation dollars put into the project. But for species such as the western spiny-tailed skink, where they're endangered, reducing any further loss of population numbers is really important. And I'd just like to thank all the organisations, supervisors and people who've been involved with my project. Thank you.
We've got plenty of time for questions. Anyone has any questions for Holly?
Thanks, Holly. That was great. Coming from the Midwest, it's good to takes me back home. Obviously, climate change is going to affect Southwest WA quite heavily, and I assume that there'll be less rainfall and higher temperatures in that region. I'm not sure what that impact would have on fire regimes, but how do you expect climate change will affect log habitats, and will they keep developing, or will it's, yeah, how do you see that playing out?
I'm not sure about developing log piles, but for the translocations, we're certainly looking into if we can't get the structures that they need, perhaps we'll have to go in and modify that, particularly for translocations, and move logs, make our own, and if there aren't enough in the landscape, we'll have to do that. But yeah, sorry, I'm not sure about the log making process in the future.
Other questions?
Thanks, Holly. I think I got this right. The cats would just check logs irrespective of whether they're inhabited or not. But the corvids were targeting inhabited log structures.
Yeah, so the cats targeted logs with the skinks over open sites, but not over logs.
So does that infer, is the inference there that the corvids already know what's special about the inhabited log structures, but the cats don't? Yeah,
so my prediction at the beginning was that the latrine piles would create the olfactory cue and it would be the cats coming in, but it appears, because the skinks, you saw some pictures are quite orange and some of the log piles are quite grey. So I'm thinking now that when they're basking, that the large image of the skink on the log pile is quite distinct, and the search image, the corvids might quite easily find, is what I'm thinking.
Any other questions? I have a question. What's the persistence of a colony of the skinks?
How long do they stay around?
Yeah, in terms of a colony, like, is it, the life of the log?
So I went into this project with basically nothing being known about the lizards. So that's why I've gone in to look at predators' diets. So we don't actually know that, but for similar species in Central Australia, they think that the young live to at least 5 before they think of dispersing. So I think they're quite long-lived.
Any other questions?
Hello, thanks for that. I'm wondering, you were saying how these predators are attracted to the novel systems in the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you have considered exploring how long that effect lasts, and maybe, have the translocations happen after a certain amount of time?
Yeah, that's a good point, to look at predator behaviour and if they're more active at different times of the year and then translocating at certain times. That's definitely a good idea, and something I could probably tell from going through my camera trap images and seeing when I see them most often. That's definitely a good point.